Welcome back to the Ignite Movements podcast. One of the things that we've tried to push all along the way is this concept of multiplying disciples, multiplying churches, and ultimately you run into one really big factor that pastors don't like to talk about, pastors aren't very good at, and that is money. What are we going to do about the money? And so I'm privileged today to be joined by Mark Deymaz. He is the author of The Coming Revolution in Church Economics. And this book is already setting us on a whole different trajectory as to where we're headed as a church and as an organization. And so, Mark, thanks so much for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about how you started down the journey that led to this book, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, Jim, let's be with you and all those that are a part of this podcast and your team. Appreciate your heart for church planning and what you're doing. I am literally finishing 40 years in full-time ministry at the end of December here, 2023. So just in 6 weeks or so. Grew up Jesuit Catholic, came to Christ as a sophomore in college. Right out of college, took a position as a youth pastor, and I did that for 18 years in various churches. The final 8 of those 18 years as a youth pastor brought me to Little Rock, Arkansas, a very large church in 1993. There were 2,000 members, 2,000 attending people on Sunday mornings, and 157 through 12th graders. That's what I took over in 1993. 8 years later, that church was 5,000 people, and our youth group was 600. I started with a secretary, ended up with 9 full-time people just for student ministries, and ended up being in the top 2% of paid youth pastors in America. Built a $3.5 million student center. We paid cash for it. I got to design it with the architects, 3 full court gyms, 36-foot climbing wall. On and on I could go. In other words, I was living the dream. Money grew on trees. Once I went to the pastor, I said, I need to add a staff member. He said, no, you need 3. And he gave me 3. I mean, where does that happen, right? So it was this tremendous era of money and growth and excitement. One day, though, in the late 90s, I looked around this otherwise amazing church and realized the only people of color were janitors. And that began to bother me. In 2001, then I left that church, stayed in Little Rock. I'm originally from the West Coast, from Scottsdale, Arizona. Had been here 8 years, came to the inner city of Little Rock, 30% poverty, highest violent crime in the city, 66% of kids without dads in a home. Determined to chase a dream, what Christianity today would call 3 years later, a big dream in Little Rock. Could diverse men and women will themselves to walk, work, and worship God together as one, to declare a credible witness of God's love for all people, not just some people on earth as it is in heaven. I should have said the church I was a part of, as wonderful as it was very wealthy, Republican, suburban, all of that. And again, a wonderful church. I couldn't be who I am or have done what I've done over the last 22, 23 years without that experience. But again, I began to take a look at the New Testament, realized that the New Testament churches were diverse, integrated, Jews and Gentiles, men and women, rich and poor, etc. So all that's to say, launched into the church 2001, planted Mosaic here in the inner city. And very quickly, which is the pivot to how I got into this, at the church I had come from, they used to calculate the average growth of the church from year to year. And they would sit in a room and say, okay, next year we anticipate 479 people joining the church. And out of the 479, this is how many people will give, and this is the average giving unit, and that's how they chart their budget. I very quickly learned in the inner city, the more people that join your church, it costs you money. People in the inner city, they take money out of the plate, they don't put money into the plate. And very quickly, we were faced with a choice. Either we're going to have a nice little church of 75, 80 people, take a paycheck, go home, sleep well at night, or we were going to aggressively meet the needs of this community. Food distribution, immigration concerns, all of this, of course, way before the rise of Black Lives Matter, everything. And the homeless that we have literally that live and die on our property right here, right where we're at. So all this to say, we recognize that tithes and offerings were not going to be enough in this environment. Maybe that was fine for the church I came from. It certainly wouldn't be here. We were going to have to develop multiple streams of income. Now, Jim, that was 22 years ago that we got on this trajectory. Over time, kind of figured it out, modeled it, and then put it forth for others. But as you know, and part of the reason for this call is because it's no longer just a little inner city church in Little Rock, Arkansas that needs to create and generate multiple streams of income. It's virtually every church in America going forward with middle class wealth, the lowest it's been since 1941, highest inflation we've had in our lifetime, on and on it can go. So now the problem we saw 22 years ago is every church's problem. And that's what we have a desire to help others understand what we came to understand over 2 decades, and hopefully move them from survival to stability and ultimately to sustainability for the sake of the gospel.
Yeah, man, that's so true. It's everybody's problem now. We ran into it. You and I talked about that. We started the first church, and the first church was just all, started out with committed Christians, and they gave so well, and we reached people. And yes, the more you reach people, the more your kind of giving per capita goes down, 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 down. But still, we had such committed givers in that first church, and that was in 2008. That we could kind of float a full-time pastor for the next church and go ahead and secure a building for the next church and that kind of thing. And so we just assumed that the second church would do the same thing and the next church would do the same thing. And financially funding a whole bunch of multiplying ministry was not going to be a big deal until we realized that, we were 8 years in and the second church was not meeting its own expenses still. And we were like, wow, like what's going on? And one of the people that I coach talks about this. He literally has people, and somebody gave him your book. It was so helpful to him because he's in a position where he's in a diverse community. He's in a low income community, and his tribe, the people that are kind of coaching him, are telling him, you just need to close up shop and move to a place where people can give better. And it's like, well, how do we reach these people? Like, so you're saying that there's no way to reach these people because it's not financially feasible. It's a completely backwards missional kind of thinking. It just doesn't make any sense. And so your book has been extremely helpful because of that. Kind of give us a 30,000 foot view of the book and the premise of the book.
Yeah, well, first of all, both the book and the concept, the philosophy of church economics is, first of all, people need to recognize it's a theological issue. It's actually an issue of stewardship. The American church thinks stewardship is management. That's not the definition of stewardship in the Bible. Stewardship is doubling. It's addition. It's multiplication. That's good stewardship. In the story of the good steward, right? You gave me 5, here's your 5, I made you 5. You gave me 2, here's your 2, I made you 2. I like to say that one guy sat on his asset, right? One guy sat on his asset, and he's called a wicked, lazy steward. The American church is literally sitting on billions and billions of dollars of assets, buried in the ground out of fear, being managed, not stewarded. This is all prior to COVID, of course, and even today. Churches and church facilities are built for Sundays, not Monday through Saturday, so they largely sit empty during the week, as do their parking lots. It's a church of 65 people that have a $2.5 million endowment in the bank. Nobody's getting saved. The community's not being engaged, but by golly, they're all proud to tell you they have $2.5 million in the bank. It's churches that own land, 5, 10, 20 acres, just sitting there for years and years, undeveloped, buried asset, wicked, lazy church. So first of all, people need to understand this isn't about, hey, let's make money, let's get rich. This is a theological issue. Largely centered in stewardship. There's many other things I could say about that, but in the book, and we always start people with the big why, it's theology, and that's just one passage, one section that tells us we need to think differently. Secondly, in the book, we also deal with sociology, because it's almost like heads and tails. You have to understand, like the men of Issachar, they understood their times and knew what was the best course of action in that moment for Israel to take. So that's a sociological concern. We have to understand our times. Our times are different than times past, different than times coming. So we have to think well about where we are as a society. I mentioned that already. Low class wealth, lowest it's been since 41. Dual income households up from 19% in 1960 up to 80%. It doesn't mean people are getting rich. It means it takes 2 or more income streams in American households just to live a generally middle class life today. And so all that's to say, in fact, even think about the wealth gaps and income inequality and the diversification of the country. All this impacts giving, sociologically speaking. For instance, nearly 80% of all giving as of 2019 to the American church was done by people born before 1964. It's not that people born after 64 don't have money. It's they think differently about money and institutions. Number one, they don't trust institutions. If you're born before 1964 in a church, you think I'm going to tithe, I'm going to give generously over and above a tithe for mission support or what have you. I serve the church and I go out and knock on doors and invite people to my church. Let's call that influence. Today, that's through social media. If you're born after 64, you don't trust the church as an institution, and you choose one of those three at any given moment. You either give money or you serve or you promote the product, if you will, on social media. And so for all these reasons, the sociological reasons is also a big part of that. And then we talk about modeling in the book. So you got theology, sociology, and then modeling, where generally speaking, creating multiple streams of income is like building out a football team with an offense, defense, and special teams. The offense doing the spiritual work, generating income for the church through tithes and offerings, that is the giving of your members. Secondly, then creating a separate nonprofit by which you can generate local, state, federal grants, outside donations to the work that you can do or scale beyond your tithes and offerings. And then, of course, the special teams, if you will, is the for-profit ROI, leveraging assets to generate income through for-profit business income. And the aggregate sum of tithes and offerings, grants and donations, and some measure of profitable income is how churches will not only survive, but be sustainable long-term beyond mere tithes and offerings. So that's an overview of the book and the concept, but again, strongly rooted in theology. And anybody who doesn't understand that is going to get into trouble if they try to roll these things out in their church, because people are going to push back primarily on theology. They're going to say something like, for instance, preacher, pastor, just preach the gospel and God will supply all your needs in Christ Jesus. Where's your faith? Just exercise faith, right? But if someone says that to you, you want to look them in the eye and say, let me ask you a question. You ever take a loan for a car that you couldn't afford? You ever take a loan for a house you couldn't buy? You ever take a loan to send your kid to college? You ever take prescription medicine? You ever go, where's your faith, man? Like, just sit in your house, pray all day, read the Bible, and go check your mailbox. You go to work every day, you try to get more money. You see, where's your faith? Individuals don't think like that. Churches can't, not only should they not think like that, they can't afford to think like that in the 21st century. So again, strong theology undergirds everything we're talking about.
Yeah, I love that. I think some of the pushback you're bound to get, and you can kind of speak to this, has got to be from people just saying, well, the way it's supposed to work is people bring their tithes and offerings, and that's how God, blesses the ministry and pushes the ministry forward. And if God calls us, he's going to supply it and that kind of thing. And then they're not looking to things like the parable of the stewards, where it expressly, shows that God expects us to be wise in how we multiply what he's given us to do the work of the ministry and to make an eternal impact. And so, yeah, what are some of the pushbacks you get from church people, so to speak, when they hear this idea that, just your subtitle, why tithes and offerings are no longer enough? Does that hit some people funny?
Absolutely. And in the book, we deal with what we call 7 erroneous assumptions that are largely based in misunderstanding of the Bible or different texts. I've already mentioned a couple of them. Stewardship is not management. It's doubling, it's multiplying. The argument from faith. Where's your faith, pastor? Just preach the gospel. But you have to help people understand they don't live like that in their own world. They go to work. They try to get raises. Again, you're not sitting around just hoping and praying and trusting God. You get married. You don't just sit in your house and wait for God to send you money. You get after it, right? So what individuals are doing, the church collectively needs to do, right? Even thinking about things like I mentioned earlier, dual income households, think about the tithe as a single income to the household. But to live a middle-class life, American households don't live like that. Again, that's a sociological thing. So we have to understand the church, like American households, needs multiple streams of income in the 21st century, again, to advance its mission. But another erroneous assumption from theology is a typical one would be like, man, we can't touch money. Jesus overturned the money changers, and no, we can't have anything to do with money, right? Well, again, in the book, we demonstrate that if that's their first answer related to that passage, they don't understand what's actually going on, because the issue was economic injustice. That's what Jesus was dealing with the money changers and the merchants. So at the temple on the money changer side, I'm sure maybe some of your listeners have been overseas. If you don't exchange your euro, for instance, in country at a bank, and you go to an airport, they're going to charge you a higher interest rate for the conversion. In the Roman world at the time of Christ in the temple, the coinage was Roman. To get into the temple, the admission was half a shekel. It's a Jewish coin. So merchants at the site would be exchanged. The exchange rate would go up percentage-wise, and of course that hurt the poor. So that was the deal with the money changers, charging exorbitant prices or interest rates on site to convert Roman coinage to Jewish shekel or to a half shekel. And then also on the merchants, they're selling animals because it required animals for animal sacrifice, and people are coming from 5 or 10 or 20 miles away. And they're not dragging their turtle doves, whatever, risking them dying, etc. on the way. They're going to buy on site, and that's why you pay $10 for a hot dog at a football stadium. You're a captive audience. So the same way with the merchant, the animals particularly, they're charging $10 for a turtle dove that should cost $1, right? So again, this is hurting the poor, and that's what Jesus is reacting to. That's why he says, "You've turned my house that should be a house of prayer for everyone," right? All nations, and of course, not just ethnic, but economic diversity. It's for everyone. You've turned it into a den of robbers and thieves. So it's not about fair profit or benevolent profit. It was about economic injustice. And so when you understand that, that frees you up. And just thinking about this, we even write about it in the book, Jim, like, can people use these principles? Could pastors or churches misuse our understanding of theology and sociology, build their own kingdoms? Absolutely, they can do that. But what we say in the book, they're already doing that. There's people that have already been doing that, right? So the point is, it shouldn't stop the rest of us with a good hearts, good accountability, etc., from practicing good theology, understanding the time, sociology, and then advancing the kingdom, our local churches, through the practice of church economics.
Yeah. Now, I would think some of the pushback you get is again from the subtitle there, is people just assume that you're saying we pursue these other streams of income and we don't worry about discipling people in the area of generosity. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's great. No, in fact, when I do live lectures and talks on this, I make it very clear at the end. It's yes to tithes and offerings, yes to grants and donations, yes to for-profit business income. So it's a all and not an either or, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. But how many more generosity series can you do? Like, we've turned every message as a generosity series because churches are declining in attendance, declining in offerings, and the American church and pastors think that the way to solve that problem is squeeze blood out of a turnip. You can't keep pressing, you can't keep begging people for money in the name of generosity, because people just don't have the kind of money we're looking for. And that whole metric is 20th century. So like you said earlier, in the 20th century, that worked. In the 21st, it's falling on deaf ears because people are barely, they're living paycheck to paycheck. I can't remember the latest figures on that. I'm going to say it's well over 50% of people are living paycheck to paycheck in this country. So all your teaching on generosity, whatever, people smile, they listen, but they might want to give, but they don't have it to give in broader numbers, and certainly not like the 20th century. So yes, we're all for it. We continue to encourage people as they're moved by God to tithe, to provide offerings, to be generous. Yes, right? But at the same time, we also want to be intentional. Same way people get saved. I mean, God and the sovereignty of God, he doesn't need any of us to save anybody. He didn't need us from the beginning, but within his sovereignty, under his sovereignty, he said the way people get saved under normal circumstances is I save them, you tell them, right? And so there's an intentionality, a partnership when people come to Christ, generally speaking, that it involves me and God. I'm not God. I don't save anybody, but under his sovereignty, he said, Mark, be intentional and partner with me. And that's the same thing here. We're to be intentional. We can't just rely on tithes and offerings, just magically that money shows up. That's not the way of God. We've also got to be intentional. So yes, we're going to pray. Yes, we're going to encourage tithes and offerings. Yes, we're going to encourage generosity. And on top of that, we're going to be intentional about pursuing additional income streams.
Yeah. Let's get into a little bit of the kind of the nitty gritty as far as how you've gone about this or examples that you've seen. And you talk about how a church can both generate income to push its mission forward, but at the same time, bless the community in how they go about it. So kind of talk about some of the examples you've seen of that or you've done yourself.
Yeah, well, and if people are watching this online, you see me looking out a glass window here into our sanctuary. But on Tuesdays is our food distribution and closed distribution day. So we have the largest food distribution in Little Rock. 67% of our zip code depends on this church for about $350 to $400 a month in fresh groceries. Free, it supplements the income. The WIC program, food stamps. So that's literally going on as we speak. So let's just take that as an example. We have in this community, again, it's a food desert, etc. So, and it's been like that for a long time. So 20 years ago, we get established. We begin giving out little boxes of food, whatever. It leads to this huge operation. Okay, now, years ago, we had started the church in 2001. And by 2003, 2004, among other things, to engage the community, we got people knocking on the door. Hey, I need food. I need help with pharmaceuticals. I'm an immigrant. Can you help me? I need money to get my car out of the impound lot. And so all these needs were coming to us. Now, what I realized early on is, again, tithes and offerings were not, we would not be able to meet those needs. Typically, a church might think benevolence. Oh, let's have a little offering of benevolence. But we were overwhelmed. I mean, the first person would take all the benevolence money we had, and because we didn't have much, right? So that's when we realized, again, think football team, if you're listening, offense, defense, special teams. And what we built out was this model based on a football team, because if you think about it, a football team is actually a team of teams. There's 3 teams on every team. And those teams actually play different games with different players, with different metrics. To win a big game, you got to have all 3 teams in place firing at a high level, right? If one team, if you can have a great offense, but if you can't stop the run, you don't win. Or in the last 3 seconds, a kick can go bad and you lose. Special teams fail. Most churches just have an offense, if you will. They have a spiritual game. That's why they're a church. Some play it better than others, but they don't have this social engagement game or the financial game. So all that's to say is that we early on began to aggregate our justice, mercy, and compassionate work. We created a separate nonprofit and shifted that type of work out from under the auspices of the church and into the auspices and oversight of the nonprofit. Now, why did we do that? That's why we get, instead of pastors, we get MSW types, executive director types, people with a heart for the community. They lead the charge like a defensive coordinator would lead defense versus an offensive coordinator. The pastors are doing the spiritual work. The MSWs, the executive directors, are leading out the social work that we do. Justice, compassion, mercy, like feeding people. Now, with all that in mind, again, just taking food distribution, it leads to this huge operation that solicits grants and donations from outside the church. So just in the last 6 months, because we have the nonprofit, and because of all the work we do, like food distribution and so much other things here locally in our community, some anonymous family in America, we don't even know who they are, they found their way to our nonprofit and they sent us $500,000 in April. Okay, wow. Just out of the blue. We don't know who they are, but they saw the work of the nonprofit. They said, that matches our desire for giving. Here's $500,000 to help you scale your work. A couple months later, I got a $180,000 city grant to work with the homeless who literally live and die on our property. We have a ton of homelessness and we deal with that every day. So just in the last 6 months, because we have a nonprofit in place and because work like food distribution is going under the nonprofit, people and like city government, you're not going to get that money if you're doing this as a church. People outside, churches don't write checks to churches. Other Christians don't write checks to other churches typically. Cities are not going to give you grants. States, federal government's not going to give you grants. Anonymous family that's not going to give a grant to your church. They're going to give it to your nonprofit. And so imagine, because structurally we have that nonprofit in place, we're able to solicit everything from $1,000, $500 now to our largest gift ever, $500,000. Actually, it's not even the largest gift. I take that back. We had 2 $800,000 gifts to our work years ago with kids who age out of foster care. Those were federal grants, $800,000. It funded that work for 10 years, $1.6 million. You don't get that kind of money from local, city, federal, whatever, unless you are doing some of this outside the church. So that's an example. One other quick one on the third leg, the financial leg. It took us 15 years to buy the building we have. So I want to encourage you, if you're planting a church, been there, done that. You got to play a long game on this. But once we had the 100,000 square foot Kmart, we're able to rent 42,000 square feet to a suburban fitness club. We rent office space. We generate right now, just on our building, about 13,000 a month in consistent rental income, not including event space. And our mortgage is 16,000 a month. So that's 13,000 more. We have $13,000 more that we have every month from tithes and offerings to go to direct ministry as opposed to bricks and mortar, because we're practicing church economics. So as quickly as I can tell you, Jim, those are a couple examples by structuring in the way that I'm suggesting the church, the nonprofit, and for-profit business, you can do more. And this is stewardship, right? This is, you're doing way more community good, Christ good, kingdom good than you would be able to do if you're just relying on tithes and offerings.
Yeah. A lot of what you just said there's two factors that I think that would keep a lot of pastors from moving forward with those concepts. I think one is clearly there's some legal things that step into. Some of the things you describe in the book could involve actual income, what's unrelated business income, things like that, which means you're stepping into kind of a new area, whereas churches just generally don't have to mess with the whole tax thing much. So that can be a little bit of a hindrance because people are afraid to step into that. And then some of it just feels like that there's risk involved, and it seems scary stepping into it. I mean, you bought $100,000 building. 100,000 square foot building, and with a $16,000 mortgage, and you're just like, yeah, and we plan on having $13,000, or whatever. And I'm probably, I'm sure a whole lot more thought went into it than that. But it just feels like there's moments where it's like, if we do that, that's going to be a risk, but it could be a fantastic, return as well. So talk a little bit about being afraid of the risk, and also being afraid of having to mess with some of the legal things that are involved.
Yeah, great question. And there's two fronts on that. So let me just say very clearly, and as you said at the outset, pastors, we weren't trained in seminary for this, whatever. You need good business people around you, a tax attorney, a tax accountant. So you need to check in your local areas, get some professionals alongside you as you begin to free your mind and wade into this. You're going to need good legal advice, good accountability from potentially a tax attorney, an accountant, whatever. Yeah, just don't go out there and make this stuff up on your own or say, oh, Mark Deymaz said this. So get professionals alongside you to ask those kinds of questions. Now, with that, having said that, on the legal side, wait, the first, what was the two that I forgot? The legal is the second. What was that first question?
Just the scariness in terms of
that's right.
the risk, stepping out and taking the risk.
Yeah. So a way to think about the scary and the risk and all that is, here's a little pithy grabber for you. I like to say there's a fine line between fear and foolishness, and that's called faith. So on the one hand, again, from the parable of the good steward, that guy sat on his asset in fear. He's afraid he's going to lose it, mismanagement, whatever. That's fear. That's not of God. On the other hand, foolishness. You cannot let foolishness, when it comes to money, drive your decision making. And foolishness would be blindly saying God will take care of it. Literally, I heard a story the other day of a pastor, because in our case, we were pursuing a building that we couldn't otherwise afford. And I got some business and good people around me. And over many months, I listened to their counsel and pulled us back from chasing that building. Okay. And we said, no, we're not interested anymore. Even though I feel still in my spirit, God wants that building for it. I listened to them. And a realtor confirmed, he said, Mark, you did the right thing. Let me tell you a story. There's another pastor in this city who this guy, the realtor, represented, and he was looking for land for his church like 2 years ago. And they found land for him, whatever. And the point is, they found him land, and he was counseled, don't do this. But he didn't listen to the counsel like this realtor said I did. And he ended up with $2 million of land and no church on that land. And they can't even pay the bills, the bottom line, because he told everyone, God will supply it. God will do it. Let's press forward in faith. That was actually foolishness, not faith. So on this first point about the scariness, if you will, you have to balance fear and foolishness. And fear is you just lock down. Foolishness is you just blindly believe, oh, God loves us, he's going to take care of us. Faith is that middle ground. It's intentionality. So we're listening on the business side, but we're also listening on the spiritual side and navigating that to determine what we're going to do. So fine line between fear and foolishness when it comes to faith, you have to exercise that middle ground of faith, listening to both sides. On the legal side, most pastors don't understand that you can actually make money as a nonprofit in this country. The IRS allows you and has set up things legally for us to make money, and churches are nonprofits. Literally, a church could have a nonprofit that is a church, or any nonprofit for that matter. For instance, you could start a business under the auspices of your nonprofit. So a nonprofit could go so far as to start an LLC or for-profit business under its auspices. You can rent your facilities. It's the simplest way to make money. You just report it as unrelated business income on your tax return. You're allowed to do this. Now, there's two major rules that govern nonprofits when it comes to making money. And if you play by these rules, you have nothing to worry about. Again, make sure, confirm. I mean, I know I'm telling you the truth, but definitely get professionals involved. But the two rules are this. Number one, if you have a nonprofit, and let's say you start for-profit business, okay? You have a commercial kitchen, you open it up as a business, cafe, whatever. Any net profit that business makes, if it's under a nonprofit, any net profit has to be returned to the general budget of the nonprofit. In other words, let's say you had a coffee shop and you made $20,000 in a year, and you had 5 elders or 5 leaders in your church. You go, hey, we made $20,000 this year. Everybody gets a $4,000 bonus. You can't do that. You can't pay a dividend to individuals. That $20,000 net has to go back into the general pot of the nonprofit. Okay, so that's one rule. The second rule is that, and staying with coffee as an example, let's say you have a commercial coffee shop. If you had whatever the business is, a commercial coffee shop in this case, you have to pay taxes on that business no different than any coffee shop in your community, in your city. You cannot leverage or seek to leverage your nonprofit status to avoid paying taxes on a business that you're involved with. And again, those are the two main rules. If you play by those rules, you're not going to have any issue with that. And so again, you get good guidance from accountants, whatever. Let me just say this. There's one other rule or regulation that the IRS says. It says a nonprofit cannot make a substantial amount of its budget from for-profit activities. The problem is the IRS doesn't define what a substantial amount is. Okay, so in other words, you can make as much as you want in that regard. Sometimes an accountant say, yeah, don't make more than 10% or don't make more than 15%. That's their own interpretation. Lawyers can argue everything. If I had a coffee shop and it was so fortunate that we had $1 million budget and we're making $800,000 a year on the coffee shop, I'd just spin it off as an LLC and then the money that the church is getting would be donated to the church, not made under the church. So that, again, that's a stipulation in the IRS, but it's nothing really to worry about. There's ways to deal with that if you had such a blessing. So the main thing is those two rules. And again, pastors, we're not trained in this. We're fearful of it, but you don't need to be, as I've just explained.
Yeah. So talk a little bit as we kind of wrap up here today about what if you're in my situation. And so we'll just talk about that for a second. Like, for instance, we have 3 buildings. One has a great deal of space on the second floor that we're not doing a lot with. One is a 27,000 square foot building, used to be a bowling alley, that we finished out 13,000 square feet for about a 300 seat auditorium and children's wings. But we've got significant areas, obviously, there that we're not doing a lot with. What would be your first step in going down this road?
Sorry, I'm just typing in a note. Yeah,
okay.
The first step on that is what you want to do is get a commercial realtor in your city to come into those spaces and say, how much is this space worth on the commercial market? Okay, I'll give you an example. Years ago, we got involved with a little church in Raleigh, Durham. 13 people in this building. They were meeting in the basement. They were renting the upstairs to a pastor in the city with multiple campuses. That church was paying the 13 people who owned the building $2,500 a month to be in that space. Okay, when I got involved, we got a commercial realtor. We found out the space was worth $8,500 a month. Not only that, we opened up the books of the 13 in the little church, and it was costing that church $2,900 a month to house the big church upstairs. So they were actually losing $400 a month, but they thought, oh, what a gift. We're so blessed to get this $2,500 a month. So then we went to the church and said, we need $6,000 a month or $6,500 a month. And we started getting 65 instead of 25, and used it not only to pay the $3,000 a month in expenses, but to hire a full-time pastor. So all that's to say is that you got to get commercial. You want to understand, what is the commercial space worth? And you don't want to give it away. I work with a church, and their sanctuary, they're having a big festival. I go, what do you charge for that? I go, oh, we don't charge anything. That's our ministry. Well, who pays for the toilet paper, the janitorial? All that's coming out of your tithes and offerings. If you keep giving your space away for free, you're not going to be here in 5 or 10 years. So you don't have to charge top dollar, though. Just like the example, when I found out the space is $8,500, I asked for $6,500. Okay, but I'm not going to get $2,500 and be happy, right? So I want to know what it's worth. I'm not in it for top dollar, but I can't just give it away or cover my expenses. We've got to make some measure of profit in that transaction. And so getting a commercial realtor involved will give you the high price or the range, and then you get into that range at the lower end to bless the community, what have you. Now, also another thing, I'll just a little shameless plug for a friend of mine, Justin Knapp, but you can look up Space Together online. Space Together is basically, think about it like an Airbnb for churches and church property. So you look it up, you can list your property with Space Together, everything from a classroom to a sanctuary, whatever. And through algorithms, they look in your communities for people that want it. Maybe it's a taekwondo studio, or maybe it's a dance or a symphony or what, and they need certain space at certain times. So it's kind of this dating site, if you will. And that's another way you can do it on your own with commercial realtors, and or go to the algorithm side through an organization called Space Together. But those are 2 steps I'd say to anybody who's got some measure of property or facility, buildings, to begin thinking, how can we leverage this to generate income and bless the community?
Yeah, that's incredible. That's incredible, man. Thank you. Mark, thanks so much for hanging out with us today. I would just say, for anybody who wants to multiply their ministry in a time where finances are going to be tight, as Mark said, it's the world that we live in today. We're way behind the 8 ball in terms of how the younger generation sees biblical generosity. On top of that, there are certain areas where it's just becoming obvious people aren't planting churches because you can't get the income there, and that's just not the mission. That's not how it should be. And so, if you want to multiply your ministry, if you want to make disciples and continue to make disciples and make disciples, even in areas where that might be a struggle financially, I just cannot recommend the book enough. And so, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, thanks for joining us on this episode of Ignite Movements podcast, and we will see you next month.